The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the void between three dying stars. It was bigger than most moons and older than many civilizations. Today it held representatives from across the galaxy, all gathered to watch the most important test in known space. Kang Dae-ho pressed his face against the viewing port and watched another species fail. The crystalline beings from the Velthari Empire had lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes on the surface of Zerion 7. Their ships were already pulling away from the cursed planet, leaving behind 3 of their team members who had simply dissolved when the toxic storms hit. That makes 47 species that have tried this year, said Park Nari, checking her datapad. She was the smartest atmospheric scientist the Terran Federation had, and she had been keeping track of every attempt at the trial of ascension. 47 failures. Dae-ho turned away from the window. The human delegation occupied a small section of the observation deck, surrounded by beings that looked like nightmares or dreams depending on your perspective. Some had too many eyes, others had no eyes at all. Some breathed methane, others lived off pure energy. But they all had one thing in common. They were all afraid of the planet below. The Kektar lasted the longest, Nari continued, reading from her notes. 18 hours before they called for evacuation. They lost half their team to something the reports just called the gravity shadows. The Kektar were 8 feet tall, had skin like metal armor, and had conquered 17 star systems through pure military might. They were considered the greatest warriors in the galaxy. If they couldn't handle Zerion 7, what hope did anyone else have? Ambassador Yoon is coming, Nari whispered. Yoon Ji-woo walked across the observation deck like she owned the place. She was small compared to most of the alien delegates, but she carried herself with the confidence that came from representing a species that had clawed its way up from a world that actively tried to kill everything on it. Behind her walked the rest of the human team that had been selected for the trial. The architect wants to speak with us, Ji-woo said without any greeting. Her voice was calm, but Dae-ho could hear the excitement underneath. This was what they had all been waiting for. The architect was older than recorded history. Some said it had been there when the first civilizations discovered faster than light travel. Others claimed it had built Nexus Prime with its own hands, though it didn't appear to have hands in any conventional sense. It was a shifting collection of light and shadow that hurt to look at directly. The human delegation made their way through, corridors filled with aliens who stepped aside to let them pass. Word had already spread about who they were and why they were here. The newest species in the galaxy wanted to attempt the trial of ascension. Most of the established civilizations thought it was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The architect waited in a chamber at the heart of Nexus Prime. The walls showed images of Zerion 7 in real time, a planet of impossible storms, shifting gravity and predators that existed in multiple dimensions at once. It was beautiful in the way that natural disasters could be beautiful, right before they killed you. The species from Terra, the architect's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have observed the failures of your betters. The Velthari master energy itself, yet their bodies dissolved in the acid rains. The Mordani have intellects that span galaxies, yet they could not solve the puzzle of survival on Zerion 7. The Kektar have conquered worlds with their military might, yet they fled from challenges that have no armies to defeat. Dae-ho looked at his teammates. Kim Min-ho was their survival expert, a man who had lived through the ice storms of Greenland and the heat waves of Death Valley. Lee So-young was their geologist, someone who had studied the volcanic regions of Earth where the ground could melt. Your boots in seconds. Choi Jae-min was a Marine who had served in the underwater cities where pressure could crush a human body in milliseconds. Han Yu-jin was their medic, trained to keep people alive in conditions that would kill most other species just by existing. We would like to attempt the trial, Ji-woo said formally. The architect's form shifted and something that might have been amusement colored its voice. Of course you would. The young species always believe they can succeed where ancient civilizations have failed. Tell me, humans, what makes you think you can survive what has broken the greatest powers in the galaxy? Nari stepped forward. She had spent months studying the sensor data from previous attempts. We've analyzed the atmospheric, Conditions, the gravitational anomalies, the predator behavior patterns, and the geological instabilities. We believe we can adapt to the environmental challenges. Adapt, the architect repeated. Yes, that is what they all believed. The Zephyrians could reshape matter with their thoughts. They believed they could adapt the planet to suit their needs. The planet consumed them in minutes. The eternal chorus existed as pure consciousness. They believed physical laws could not touch them. They were wrong. Minho spoke up for the first time. With respect, those species tried to change the planet to fit them. We're planning to change ourselves to fit the planet. And how exactly do you plan to change yourselves to survive conditions that have killed beings far more advanced than your species? Deho found himself grinning. We won't change ourselves. We're already adapted for this kind of thing. The chamber fell silent, except for the hum of the station's systems. Through the walls, they could hear the distant sounds of other species discussing the humans in languages that sounded like music or mathematics or controlled explosions. Explain, the architect demanded. Earth is what you might call a death world, Yujin said calmly. Our oceans are filled with creatures that can kill us in dozens of different ways. Our weather systems regularly produce storms that can level cities. Our geological activity can split continents. Our atmosphere has the perfect composition to support massive fires that can burn for months. And that's just the natural hazards. We also share the planet with diseases that can kill millions, plants that are poisonous to touch, and animals that view us as food. Jamin added. Every human who reaches adulthood has survived at least a dozen things that should have killed them. So Young pulled up a holographic display of Earth. Our species built civilizations on earthquake fault lines, in the paths of hurricanes, next to active volcanoes, and in deserts where the temperature can kill exposed humans in hours. We don't just adapt to hostile environments. We prefer them. The architect studied the images of Earth with what might have been fascination. Your world is indeed hostile to life, yet you have not just survived but thrived. This is unusual. The current way we see it, Deho said. Zerion 7 is just another Tuesday for us. The observation chamber's walls shifted to show live feeds from the planet's surface. Acid storms raged across continents of unstable matter. Creatures that looked like living nightmares hunted through forests of crystallized time. Gravity wells opened and closed randomly, crushing anything that fell into them. You see this? The architect gestured to the hellscape below. And you feel no fear? Nari looked at the images and shrugged. It looks challenging, but we've seen worse. Worse? What could possibly be worse than Zerion 7? Peak hour traffic in Seoul during monsoon season, Jiwoo said with a completely straight face. The architect's form flickered in what might have been confusion. I do not understand this reference. That's okay, Minho said cheerfully. You don't have to understand it. You just have to let us go down there and get your crystal. For a long moment, the ancient being regarded the 6 humans who stood before it without any apparent fear of the most dangerous planet in known space. Finally, its voice carried something that sounded almost like curiosity. Very well. You may attempt the trial of ascension. However, I must warn you, no species has ever returned from the surface of Zerion 7 with the quantum crystal. Most do not return at all. That's fine, Deho said. We weren't really planning on following their example anyway. As the human team prepared to leave the chamber, the architect's voice followed them. I have existed for millions of years and witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. I am curious to see what the Deathworlders will do differently. Jamin paused at the doorway and looked back. Probably laugh. The descent to Zerion 7 began at dawn, though dawn on this planet was more like watching the universe catch fire. The human landing craft shook as it entered the atmosphere, buffeted by winds that contained enough electrical charge to power a small city. Through the viewports, the team could see storms that twisted through dimensions, creating impossible colors that human eyes had never been designed to process. Landing zone coming up in 30 seconds, Nari announced from the pilot's seat. She was fighting the controls as atmospheric pressure tried to crush their small ship. The good news is we're still intact. The bad news is everything else. Daeho checked his equipment one more time. Each team member carried survival gear designed specifically for extreme environments, but even their best technology seemed inadequate for what waited below. The landing zone was a relatively stable patch of crystallized ground between two active storm systems that the previous expedition reports had called reality distortion events. Define stable, Minho asked, watching the ground shift colors through the viewport. It hasn't killed anyone in the last 6 hours, Nari replied. Good enough for me. The landing was rough. The ship touched down on what looked like solid rock, but the ground immediately began to adapt to their presence. Crystalline formations grew around the landing struts, not attacking but studying, as if the planet itself was curious about these new visitors. Atmosphere is breathable, Yujin announced, checking her sensors. Barely. Oxygen content is acceptable, but there are trace elements that will probably cause hallucinations after prolonged exposure. What kind of hallucinations? So Young asked while gathering her geological equipment. The kind where you see things that might actually be there. They opened the airlock and stepped onto the surface of Zarian 7. The first thing that hit them was the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the planet itself, like the world was singing a song in frequencies that made human bones vibrate. The second thing was the smell, which was somehow both familiar and completely alien, like ozone mixed with flowers that had never evolved on any planet humans had ever seen. Well, Jamin said, looking around at the landscape of impossible geometry and shifting matter. This is cozy. The comment broke whatever tension had been building in the group. Daeho found himself chuckling. Then Minho started laughing, and within seconds the entire team was standing on the surface of the most dangerous planet in known space, having a good laugh about their situation. Above them, monitoring from Nexus Prime, the alien observers watched this display with growing confusion. The Velthari delegation, what remained of them after their failed attempt, could not understand how these creatures could find humor in a place that had dissolved 3 of their finest warriors. The Kektar survivors, still recovering from their traumatic experience, watched the humans with something approaching disbelief. Are they broken? Asked the Mordani observer, its massive intellect struggling to process human behavior. Have they suffered some form of psychological damage that prevents them from recognizing danger? On the surface, the human team began their trek toward the planet's core. The quantum crystal they needed was located approximately 2,000 kilometers down, through layers of reality that became increasingly unstable the deeper one went. Previous expeditions had made it anywhere from a few hundred meters to, in the case of the Kektar, almost 50 kilometers before being forced to retreat. The first major obstacle appeared within an hour of landing. A forest of what looked like trees made from living metal blocked their path, but as they approached it became clear that these were not trees at all. They were the crystallized remains of some previous expedition, transformed into part of the landscape by exposure to the planet's unique energy fields. Cheerful, So Young commented, taking readings from the formations. Looks like silicon-based life forms, probably the Christek Empire expedition from about 50 years ago. Can we go around? Nari asked. We could, but it would add about 2 days to our journey. And according to the scans, the alternate route goes through something called a gravity marsh. What's a gravity marsh? Exactly what it sounds like, but worse. Minho studied the crystallized forest and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified camping tool. Or we could go through. I brought some gear that should handle this. As he worked, acid rain began to fall from the purple sky. Other team members deployed protective covers while Minho continued his work, seemingly unbothered by the fact that the precipitation was capable of dissolving most known materials. This is just like that camping trip in Oregon, he said conversationally as he attached some kind of resonator to one of the crystallized trees. Remember the one where it rained battery acid for 3 days straight? That was a chemical plant. Accident, Yujin pointed out while treating a small burn on Daeho's arm where a drop had gotten past his protective gear. Details, Minho replied, activating his device. The resonator sent out a pulse that caused the crystallized forest to vibrate at a specific frequency. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the formations began to shift, rearranging themselves to create a clear path through the center of the forest. "How did you know that would work?" Nari asked. "I didn't, but everything resonates at some frequency. I just had to find the right one." They made their way through the shifting crystal formations, past the transformed remains of beings from a dozen different species. The planet seemed to preserve everything that died on its surface, turning death into a kind of twisted art installation. As they walked, Jae-min kept up a running commentary. "Nice technique on the crystallization. Very artistic. Oh, look at that one. That's definitely a Zephyrian command structure. You can tell by the way the crystals spiral. They probably tried to terraform this section." "Is this really the time for sightseeing?" Daeho asked. "When else are we going to get the chance to see this stuff up close? Besides, if we don't come back, at least we'll have some good last words." The forest ended at the edge of what their maps called the shifting plains. The ground here changed consistency every few steps, from solid rock to liquid metal to something that might have been compressed starlight. Gravity pulled in different directions depending on where you stood, and the horizon bent in ways that made navigation nearly impossible. "Okay," So-young said, consulting her instruments. "This is where it gets tricky." "This is where it gets tricky?" Yujin asked. "What was the acid rainforest then?" "The easy part." As if summoned by their conversation, something rose from the shifting ground ahead of them. It was roughly the size of a building, but shaped like no creature that had ever evolved naturally. It had too many limbs, eyes that opened in dimensions humans couldn't properly perceive, and a mouth that seemed to lead to somewhere very far away and very dark. The creature studied the humans for a moment, then made a sound like reality tearing. Previous expedition reports had described similar encounters as psychologically devastating and inducing immediate panic responses in all known sapient species. Minho looked at the creature thoughtfully. It's like a cross between a giant squid and that weird sculpture outside the museum in New Geneva. Should we run?" Nari asked. "From what? It's not actually attacking us, I think it's just curious." Daeho pulled out his xenobiology scanner and began taking readings. "Fascinating. It exists partially in our dimension and partially in at least 3 others. The energy signature suggests it's not actually hostile, just territorial." The creature made another reality-tearing sound and extended one of its impossible limbs toward the group. Instead of backing away, Yujin stepped forward and held out her hand. The limb touched her palm with something that felt like warm electricity. "It's trying to communicate," she announced. "I think it wants to know what we are." "Tell it we're tourists," Jaemin suggested. Yujin concentrated for a moment, then nodded. "I think it understands. It's offering to guide us through the shifting plains. Why would it do that? Maybe it's bored. How often do you think it gets visitors who don't immediately run away screaming?" The creature, apparently satisfied with whatever it had learned from touching Yujin, began to move across the impossible terrain. It moved by folding space around itself, a form of locomotion that should have been impossible but seemed perfectly natural for a being that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Follow the interdimensional tour guide," Minho said cheerfully. "Just another day at the office." As they crossed the shifting plains, more creatures appeared. Each one was stranger than the last, but none of them showed any hostility toward the humans. Instead, they seemed genuinely curious about these small beings who walked through their nightmare landscape without apparent fear. "I think we're the first expedition that hasn't tried to fight everything we've encountered," Daeho observed as something that looked like a flying geometric equation circled overhead. "Maybe that's why everyone else failed," So-young suggested. "They came here expecting to conquer a hostile environment. We just came here to survive it. There's a difference? On Earth, everything is hostile. We learned a long time ago that the trick isn't to fight the environment. It's to become part of it." Their interdimensional guide led them to the edge of a chasm that stretched to the horizon in both directions. At the bottom, but the descent into the planet's deeper layers revealed wonders that challenged the basic understanding of physics. Time moved differently here, flowing backward in some corridors and sideways in others. The team found themselves having conversations with their own echoes from 30 minutes in the future, while walking through tunnels that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "This is getting weird," Nari announced as she watched her own reflection age 40 years in a mirror made of crystallized time. "Weird how?" Minho asked, consulting a compass that pointed in directions that didn't technically exist. "I just had a conversation with myself from tomorrow. Apparently we make it through this section, but I wouldn't tell me how." So Young was taking geological samples from walls that kept changing their molecular composition. Her equipment registered the same rock as being simultaneously granite, liquid mercury, and some form of organized light. "The quantum structure down here is completely unstable. Matter exists in multiple states at once until something forces it to choose." They had been underground for 6 hours, making progress that should have been impossible according to every previous expedition report. Where other species had been stopped by the temporal anomalies, the humans simply adapted their planning to account for causality running backward. Where reality distortions had driven entire research teams insane, they treated each new impossibility as an interesting puzzle to solve. "Contact ahead," Jamin announced, checking his motion detectors. "Something big." The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that contained what could only be described as a pocket universe. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that formed words in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Gravity pulled in all directions at once, creating floating islands of matter that drifted through space according to rules that changed every few seconds. And everywhere, watching them from the shadows between dimensions, were the Guardians. They weren't quite creatures and not quite forces of nature. They were the accumulated fears and terrors of every species that had ever attempted the trial, given form and substance by the planet's reality-shaping properties. The Velthari had faced their fear of dissolution and been consumed by acid storms. The Kektar had encountered their terror of military defeat and been overwhelmed by unstoppable enemies. The Mordani had confronted their dread of ignorance and been lost in mazes of unknowable knowledge. The Guardians studied the humans and began to manifest the fears that should have paralyzed them. Deho found himself facing a twisted version of Earth where all life had gone extinct due to his failures as a xenobiologist. Nari saw atmospheres collapsing across a dozen worlds because of her miscalculations. Minho watched humanity freeze to death because he couldn't teach them to survive. The humans looked at their worst nightmares made manifest and did something that broke the Guardians' understanding of how fear was supposed to work. They got annoyed. "Oh, come on," Yujin said, watching a vision of herself failing to save patients during a plague outbreak. "That's not even realistic. I've dealt with actual plague outbreaks and I know proper quarantine procedures. This is lazy fear-mongering," Jamin declared, facing down a scenario where Earth's military forces were completely helpless against an alien invasion. "Any decent invasion force would have trouble with our logistics alone. You clearly haven't studied human military history." So Young was particularly unimpressed with her vision of geological disasters destroying human civilization. "Seriously? That's the best you can do? We've been living with geological disasters for our entire evolutionary history. We build cities on fault lines for fun." The Guardians, faced with beings who critiqued their manifestation of primal terror like it was a poorly researched school presentation, began to panic themselves. They had existed for millions of years, feeding on fear and despair. They had no idea how to handle creatures who treated existential dread as a minor inconvenience. "Maybe try economic collapse," Minho suggested helpfully. "That one actually worries us sometimes." "Or social media arguments," Nari added. "Those can get pretty terrifying." Deho was studying the Guardians with his xenobiology equipment. "Fascinating. They're not actually malevolent entities. They're more like antibodies. The planet creates them to test whether a species is psychologically ready for whatever's deeper down." "What happens if we fail the test?" Yujin asked. "Probably what happened to everyone else. We get overwhelmed by our own fears and either die or retreat. And if we pass? I guess we find out what's worth protecting with fear-based security." The Guardians made one final attempt, manifesting a collective human nightmare, the complete heat death of the universe, with humanity as the last species alive, watching entropy claim everything that had ever existed or ever would exist. The top were humans looked at this ultimate vision of cosmic despair and shrugged. At least we'd win, Jaemin pointed out. And think of the research opportunities, Daeho added. We'd have billions of years to study the fundamental structure of reality. Plus, we'd finally get some peace and quiet, Minho said. No more traffic, no more noise pollution. The Guardians gave up. They had spent eons perfecting the art of psychological warfare, and these creatures had just treated the end of everything as a minor improvement in their living conditions. With sounds that might have been frustrated sighs, the fear entities dissolved back into the quantum foam from which they had emerged. The pocket universe rearranged itself, creating a clear path to the chamber's exit. As they walked across floating islands held together by localized gravity fields, So-Young couldn't help but admire the engineering. This place would make an amazing tourist destination, she observed. Imagine the view from those orbital platforms. The locals seem friendly enough, Nari agreed, waving at something that looked like a geometric proof that had achieved consciousness. Bit quiet, though, Yu-Jin noted. Could use some background music. As if responding to her comment, the chamber began to fill with harmonics that sounded like whale songs performed by crystalline wind chimes. The music came from the structure of space itself, created by gravitational waves interacting with the pocket dimension's altered physics. Okay, that's actually pretty nice, Yu-Jin admitted. They reached the far exit just as the temporal distortions began to stabilize. According to Nari's instruments, they had been in the chamber for either 3 minutes or 6 hours, depending on which frame of reference you used. The important thing was that they were making steady progress toward the planet's core. The next section was labeled on their maps as the Deep Mysteries, which So-Young noted was probably not a good sign for geological stability. The tunnels here were carved from something that wasn't quite rock and wasn't quite metal, but had properties of both. The walls showed scenes from the history of the galaxy, but the images moved and changed as they watched, showing alternate timelines where different choices had led to different outcomes. Look at this, Daeho called out, pointing to a section of wall that showed Earth's first contact with alien life. But in this version, instead of the peaceful diplomatic exchange that had actually occurred, the image showed humans and aliens engaged in a massive space battle. Parallel universe? Nari suggested. More likely a probability shadow, So-Young corrected, taking readings from the wall. The planet is showing us what might have happened if history had gone differently. They spent some time exploring the various alternate histories displayed on the walls. In some timelines, humanity had never developed space travel. In others, they had conquered the galaxy through military might. One particularly interesting sequence showed a universe where humans had evolved as aquatic creatures and built their civilization underwater. I wonder if those versions of us would handle this place better or worse, Minho mused. Probably about the same, Jaemin replied. Humans are humans, regardless of the details. The tunnel ended at another vast chamber, but this one was different from the pocket universe above. This space contained the ruins of an ancient civilization, buildings that stretched impossibly high, and technology that operated on principles that modern science hadn't discovered yet. And moving through the ruins, studying the remains, were other figures. Are those? Yu-Jin began. Previous expedition members, Daeho confirmed, checking his scanners. But they're not quite there anymore. The figures were translucent, existing more as memories than as physical beings. They were the explorers from dozens of species who had made it this far into the planet's depths before being claimed by whatever force preserved consciousness in this place. They moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, cataloging artifacts and recording data that no one would ever read. Creepy, Nari observed, but at least they seem peaceful. One of the figures, which might have been a Velthari scientist from centuries ago, noticed the humans and approached them. When it spoke, its voice came from several directions at once, as if the chamber itself was translating. New travelers, you should not be here. The deep places are not meant for the living. We're just passing through, Minho replied conversationally. Looking for the quantum crystal. Don't mind us. The crystal is for barely visible. The final descent took them through layers of reality that existed before the universe had settled on its current laws of physics. Here, in the deep heart of Zirion 7, matter and energy danced to rules that predated the formation of galaxies. The walls around them pulsed with a rhythm that matched no known heartbeat, and the air itself seemed alive with possibility and ancient memory. "We're close," So Young announced, checking her instruments. Her geological equipment was registering readings that shouldn't have been possible, rock formations that existed in negative space, mineral deposits that aged backward through time, and at the center of it all, a quantum signature that matched the theoretical models for the crystal they sought. But as they descended the final tunnel toward the planet's core, Deho began to understand the true nature of their trial. His xenobiology scanners were picking up patterns in the energy readings, patterns that looked suspiciously familiar. "Nari," he called out, "run a comparative analysis on the atmospheric data from this level and the data from Earth's core." Nari pulled out her equipment and began the scan. After a few minutes, she looked up with an expression of surprise and growing understanding. The energy signatures match. Not similar, identical. This planet has the same quantum resonance as Earth. "That's impossible," Eugene said. "Earth and Zirion 7 are on opposite sides of the galaxy. They formed from completely different stellar material." "Unless they didn't form naturally," Minho said quietly. He was studying the walls around them with the eye of someone who had spent his life learning to read the subtle signs that distinguished natural formation from artificial construction. "Look at the way these tunnels are carved. This isn't geological process, this is engineering." As they continued deeper, the truth began to reveal itself in pieces. The quantum crystal they sought wasn't just a test object. It was a key, one of many that had been placed throughout the galaxy by an ancient civilization. And Zirion 7 wasn't a natural death world that had been chosen for the trial of ascension. It was a testing ground, specifically designed to find species that could handle the responsibility of wielding the technology the crystals unlocked. "The planet is alive," Deho realized as they entered the final chamber. "Not just biologically alive, consciously alive. It's been evaluating every species that attempts the trial, testing not just their survival abilities but their character, their decision-making, their potential for growth." The chamber that housed the quantum crystal was a sphere of crystallized starlight suspended in a void that existed outside normal spacetime. Floating in the center, pulsing with the same rhythm as the planet itself, was a crystal formation that contained enough concentrated energy to power civilizations or destroy them. But they were not alone in the chamber. Standing between them and the crystal were the preserved consciousnesses of every explorer who had ever reached this deep into Zirion 7. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species, all drawn by the crystal's call, all absorbed by the planet's testing protocol when they proved unworthy of the power it represented. "You have come for the heart," one of them said, a figure that might once have been a Kektar warrior. "As we all did. As we all failed to obtain." "What happened to you?" Eugene asked, approaching the consciousness with the same gentle manner she had used with the scientist above. "We reached the crystal. We understood its power. And we sought to claim it for our own purposes." The warrior's form flickered as ancient memories played across its translucent features. "I wanted to use it to make my people the greatest military force in the galaxy. Others sought knowledge or wealth or the power to reshape reality according to their desires. And the planet stopped you? The planet tested us. It showed us what we would do with such power, made us live through the consequences of our ambitions. Every species that has attempted this trial has ultimately wanted the crystal for selfish purposes. So the planet preserved us here, adding our knowledge and experience to its own understanding of galactic civilization." Deho looked around at the hundreds of preserved consciousnesses, representatives of the greatest civilizations the galaxy had ever known. What would it take to pass the test? "A species that doesn't want the power for themselves," another consciousness replied, this one bearing the energy signature of a Mordani philosopher. "A species that understands that some responsibilities are too great for any one civilization to bear." The humans looked at each other, then at the crystal floating in its sphere of crystallized starlight. The quantum formation was beautiful, beyond description, containing enough power to solve every problem their species had ever faced. With it, humanity could become the dominant force in the galaxy, could reshape entire star systems according to their needs, could ensure their survival against any possible threat. So, Minho said conversationally, what if we don't take it? The question sent ripples through the assembled consciousnesses. In all the eons that Xerion 7 had been testing species, no expedition had ever suggested leaving the crystal where it was. What do you mean? The Kektar warrior asked. I mean, what if we came all this way just to prove we could? What if the real test isn't about taking the crystal, but about having the wisdom not to? Nari was running scans on the chamber's structure, mapping the energy flows that kept the crystallized starlight sphere stable. According to these readings, the crystal isn't just a power source. It's a regulatory mechanism. It's what keeps this entire region of space stable. Remove it and you destabilize the quantum foundations of at least 12 star systems, including Earth. So Young added, checking her own instruments. The gravitational effects would cascade across the galaxy. Billions of worlds would be affected. Yujin looked at the crystal with her medical training's emphasis on first doing no harm. Any species advanced enough to use this responsibly would also be advanced enough to understand that using it would be catastrophically irresponsible. Jamin nodded slowly. It's the ultimate test. You can only pass by refusing to complete it. The preserved consciousnesses watched as the humans came to their decision without agonizing over it, without lengthy debates about the benefits they could gain versus the costs to others. They simply looked at the situation, understood the implications, and chose to do the right thing. We came here to retrieve the quantum crystal, Deho announced to the chamber. Mission accomplished. We found it, we confirmed its location and status, and we're reporting back that it's exactly where it needs to be. You're not going to take it? The Mordani philosopher asked. Why would we? It belongs here. This whole planet is basically a museum and research facility dedicated to understanding galactic civilization. Taking the crystal would be like stealing the centerpiece from the exhibit. The sphere of crystallized starlight began to pulse brighter, and the quantum crystal at its center resonated with harmonics that filled the chamber with music that sounded like the birth of stars. Throughout the room, the preserved consciousnesses began to smile as they felt a change that had been building for millions of years finally reach completion. The test is complete. The planet's voice spoke through the crystal, no longer the harsh challenge it had been, but warm with something approaching affection. For the first time since the trials began, a species has proven worthy not by claiming power but by refusing it. The walls around them became transparent, revealing the true scope of Xerion 7's purpose. The entire planet was a vast library and testing facility, created by an ancient civilization to preserve knowledge and find species mature enough to be trusted with the responsibility of guiding galactic development. Every test the humans had faced had been designed not to stop them but to evaluate their character. The Deathworld hypothesis was correct but incomplete, the planet continued. Species that evolve on hostile worlds do develop superior survival skills. But more importantly, they develop the wisdom that comes from understanding that survival is not about dominating your environment, but about finding your place within it. The preserved consciousnesses began to fade, not into oblivion but into something that looked like peace. Their long service as unwilling guardians was ending, replaced by a new understanding of what the trials were meant to accomplish. Thank you, the Kektar warrior said to the humans as his form became translucent with approaching rest. We spent so long focused on what we could take that we forgot to consider what we could give. As the ancient guardians found their rest, new pathways opened throughout the chamber. The planet was revealing its true treasures, not weapons or technologies of power, but libraries of knowledge collected from across the galaxy, peaceful technologies for healing and growth, and most importantly, the location of other testing worlds where similar trials awaited species ready to take the next step in galactic civilization. So what now? Minho asked as they prepared to begin their journey back to the surface. Now we go home, Deho replied. And we tell the galaxy that the real trial wasn't about surviving Xerion 7. It was about understanding that some things are more important than survival. The planet began to shift around them, creating easier paths back to the surface. The return journey that should have taken days was compressed into hours as Zerion 7 revealed its true nature, as a place of learning rather than a place of testing. The storms calmed. The predators BK. The return to Nexus Prime should have been a moment of quiet celebration, but the human team found themselves at the center of something much larger than they had expected. Word had spread throughout the galaxy that the Deathworlders had not only survived the trial of ascension, but had fundamentally changed what the trial meant. Ambassador Yoon Ji-woo waited at the docking bay as their transport settled onto the landing platform. Around her, representatives from dozens of species had gathered to witness the return of the first expedition to survive Zerion 7 intact. But these weren't the same alien delegates who had watched the humans depart with barely concealed amusement at their presumption. These were beings who had spent the last 36 hours watching sensor feeds that defied everything they thought they knew about survival, exploration, and the nature of power itself. "Status report," Ji-woo requested as the team disembarked. "Mission accomplished," Daeho replied, though his grin suggested there was more to the story than those two words contained. "We found the quantum crystal, confirmed its location and function, and determined that it's exactly where it belongs." "And where is that exactly?" "At the heart of the greatest library and research facility in the galaxy, where it's been maintaining the stability of local spacetime for the last 1,000,000 years or so." The architect materialized beside them, its ancient consciousness focused entirely on the human team. "You did not retrieve the crystal. We retrieved the information about the crystal," Nari corrected. "Which was the actual point of the exercise, wasn't it? You weren't really testing whether we could steal something that keeps 12 star systems from collapsing. You were testing whether we were smart enough not to." For the first time in its vast existence, the architect experienced something that might have been surprise. "In all the eons since the trials began, you are the first to understand that the crystal was never meant to be taken. Every other species saw it as a prize to be claimed. Every other species probably didn't grow up on a planet that spent millions of years teaching them that some things are too dangerous to mess with," Minho observed. "We learned early that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should." The alien delegates who had gathered to witness their return began to murmur among themselves in languages that ranged from harmonic crystals to controlled explosions to pure mathematics. The implications of what the humans had accomplished were rippling through the assembled representatives like shockwaves through water. "The trial was never about survival at all," the Velthari ambassador said, its crystalline voice carrying notes of wonder and something that might have been humility. "It was about wisdom and character," added the Mordani representative. "The planet was evaluating not what we could do, but what we would do with power once we obtained it." So Young was already working on her geological report, documenting the true nature of Zerion 7 for the scientific community. The planet itself is the most sophisticated consciousness evaluation system ever created. Every challenge we faced was designed to test our decision-making processes under stress. The environment wasn't trying to kill us, it was trying to understand us. Eugene had spent the return journey analyzing the medical data from their expedition. The hallucinations, the fear responses, the psychological pressure, all of it was carefully calibrated to reveal how we react when faced with impossible choices. The planet was basically conducting the most comprehensive psychological evaluation in galactic history. Jaemin looked around at the assembled alien delegates with the practical eye of someone trained to assess potential threats and allies. "The question now is what happens next. We've proven that humans can pass the test, but what does that actually mean for galactic politics?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Throughout Nexus Prime, communication systems began broadcasting a message that originated from Zerion 7 itself. The planet, silent for millions of years except to those who reached its deepest chambers, was speaking to the galaxy for the first time. "The trials are ending," the planetary consciousness announced in harmonics that translated into every known language simultaneously. "For too long, I have preserved the failures of civilizations that sought power without wisdom. But the Deathworlders have shown that evolution can produce not just survival skills, but the moral development necessary to handle responsibility. Screens throughout the station showed images from across the galaxy. Other testing worlds like Zarion 7, each one holding different trials, different challenges, different opportunities for species to prove their readiness for the next phase of galactic development. The humans have qualified as galactic custodians, the architect announced, its voice carrying across every communication channel in known space. They are authorized to attempt the other trials, to help guide species through challenges that have blocked galactic development for eons, and to serve as mediators when civilizations face choices that require wisdom rather than strength. Galactic custodians? Deho asked. What does that actually involve? When the impossible happens, the architect replied. When ancient horrors awaken, when reality itself becomes unstable, when species face challenges that threaten not just their survival, but their fundamental nature, you will be called. The Deathworlders who laugh at the impossible will serve as the galaxy's crisis response team. The job description should have been terrifying. Instead, the human team looked at each other and began to smile. This was what they had trained for their entire lives without knowing it. Every natural disaster on Earth, every impossible survival situation, every moment when they had faced the end of everything and found a way to keep going, it had all been preparation for this. Does the position come with benefits? Minho asked because someone had to ask the practical questions. Access to the galactic archive networks, the architect replied. Transportation to anywhere in known space. Priority support from all member civilizations. And the knowledge that when the universe faces its darkest moments, there are beings who will meet them with laughter and determination. Nari was already thinking about the atmospheric challenges they might face on other worlds. Are all the testing planets as interesting as Zarion 7? Each one is unique. Some test courage in the face of cosmic horror. Others evaluate compassion when dealing with species that seem irredeemably hostile. One tests the ability to maintain hope when confronted with the inevitable heat death of the universe. That last one sounds like a typical Monday for us, Eugene observed. As the implications of humanity's new role in galactic affairs began to sink in, representatives from across the galaxy approached the human delegation, not with the barely concealed condescension they had shown before, but with genuine respect and something that looked like relief. The proud Kektar, whose greatest warriors had fled from Zarion 7 in terror, offered military support for any human operations that required force. The brilliant Mordani, whose vast intellects had been unable to solve the trial's challenges, volunteered to provide research assistance for future missions. The energy-manipulating Velthari offered to share technologies that could help humans survive in environments even more hostile than Earth. Why? Jiwoo asked the Kektar commander. Your species has never acknowledged another as equals. Why offer to serve under human leadership? Because, the warrior replied, leadership is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. It is about being willing to face the impossible for the sake of others. And your species has proven that they will laugh at the impossible and ask if there's anything else they can help with. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Nexus Prime had ever hosted. Representatives from 1,000 worlds toasted the species that had solved the galaxy's oldest puzzle, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the simple wisdom of knowing when not to take what was offered. But perhaps the most important moment came when Deho found himself alone with the architect, looking out at the stars through one of the station's massive viewing ports. No, he said conversationally. There's something I've been wondering about. What is that, custodian? How many other species out there are like us? How many other Deathworlders are developing the same kinds of survival skills and moral flexibility? The architect's form shifted in what might have been satisfaction. An excellent question, and one that I believe will be answered as more testing worlds become active. The trials were designed to find not just one species suitable for custodial duties, but many. The galaxy is vast and full of challenges that require different kinds of wisdom. So this is just the beginning? This is the beginning of the next phase of galactic development. Your species has proven that evolution can produce not just intelligence and strength, but the judgment necessary to use them responsibly. Now we discover what other forms that judgment might take. As the celebration continued around them, the human team began planning their next mission. There were testing worlds to explore, species to guide through their own trials, and crises to resolve across the galaxy. It was